The gunshot echoed through Pine Creek Valley as Maddox Quinn pulled the trigger on his past, watching a plume of dust rise from the freshly dug hole in the hard Montana soil. It was 1879, and some secrets needed to stay buried in the high country, a lesson he'd learned the hard way. "That ought to do it," he muttered, shoveling the last of the dirt over what he'd hidden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountainside as he wiped sweat from his brow. His weathered face, tanned from years under the western sun, revealed little of the turmoil within. At 32, Maddox had seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes. From this ridge, he could see all of Pine Creek below, the small but growing settlement with its wooden buildings, the stagecoach station, and the modest homesteads dotting the valley floor. And if he squinted, just beyond the cluster of cottonwoods by the creek, he could make out the Quinn ranch he'd abandoned 3 years ago. The ranch where Penny Donovan would be waiting, just as she'd promised. Maddox mounted his dappled gray stallion and took one final look at the disturbed earth. Some ghosts weren't meant to be outrun, they had to be confronted, defeated, and buried. He'd done just that. Now it was time to see if anything remained of the life he'd left behind. The trail down from the hills was treacherous in the fading light. Rocks skittered beneath his horse's hooves, sending small avalanches of pebbles down the steep slope. The air grew cooler as dusk settled over the valley, bringing with it the scent of pine and sage. As he neared the bottom, Maddox noticed a lone figure standing by the fence line of his old property. Even in the dimming light, he recognized the silhouette immediately, the way she stood with her shoulders straight, her long dress moving slightly in the evening breeze. Penny had grown her hair longer since he'd been gone. It cascaded down her back in waves of chestnut brown. She didn't turn as he approached, though she must have heard the horse's footfalls. The last rays of sunlight caught in her hair, giving it a coppery glow. "Didn't think you'd actually wait," Maddox said, his voice rough from disuse. Penny turned then, her green eyes meeting his blue ones. 3 years had changed her. The softness of youth had given way to something more determined in her features. At 25, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "I said I would," she replied simply. 3 years, Maddox. You said you'd be back in 3 years. He dismounted, landing in the dust with a soft thud. "Down to the day." "Down to the day," she echoed. There was neither accusation nor warmth in her voice, just acknowledgement of a promise kept. Maddox took a step toward her, then stopped. The distance between them felt greater than the mere yards that separated them. "The ranch looks good. Your brother Michael helped when he could. Before he moved to Oregon." Penny's hands smoothed down her faded blue dress. "I've been managing." "Alone?" A small smile played at her lips. "Not entirely. You left me with 26 head of cattle. Now there's 42. Turns out I have a knack for ranching." Pride swelled in Maddox's chest. "I never doubted it." The awkward silence that followed was broken by the distant howl of a coyote. Penny glanced toward the darkening hills where Maddox had come from. "Did you do what you needed to do up there?" she asked. Maddox nodded slowly. "It's done. Are you going to tell me what it was?" "Someday. Not tonight." He reached for his horse's reins. "If you'll still have me, I'd like to come home." Penny studied him for a long moment, the dying light casting shadows across her face. "The house is where you left it. I've kept your room as it was." Not an embrace, not a declaration of enduring love, but it was a start. Maddox felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. He'd half expected to find her married, or gone, not patiently managing his ranch, waiting for a man who might never have returned. They walked side by side toward the small ranch house, the silence between them filled with unasked questions and unspoken words. The house looked much the same. The porch had been mended, and fresh curtains hung in the windows. Inside, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke greeted him. A pot simmered on the cookstove. "Venison stew," Penny explained, moving to stir it. "I shot the buck myself last week." Maddox raised an eyebrow. "You've learned to hunt?" "I've learned to survive," she countered, ladling stew into 2 bowls. Sit. You must be hungry. He washed his hands in the basin by the door before taking his seat at the table, his father's table, built with strong hands that had long since returned to dust. The familiar weight of being home pressed down on him, comforting and suffocating all at once. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional crackle from the stove. When they finished, Penny collected the dishes. You look tired, she said, not meeting his eyes. Been riding hard for days to get back on time. She nodded. Your room's ready. We can talk more tomorrow. Maddox wanted to reach for her hand, to pull her close and breathe in the lavender scent of her hair, but the wall between them was too freshly built to breach so quickly. Instead, he nodded and picked up his saddlebags. Thank you, Penny. For everything. Her eyes softened slightly. Welcome home, Maddox. In his room, everything was just as he'd left it. The quilt his mother had made stretched across the bed, his father's old rifle mounted on the wall, books stacked neatly on the small desk. But there was something new, a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. The gesture spoke volumes about the woman who'd placed them there. Maddox sat heavily on the bed, his body weary from the journey and his soul exhausted from the burden he'd finally laid to rest in the hills. He pulled off his boots and stretched out on the bed, not bothering to undress. Within minutes he was asleep. Dawn broke with the distant crow of a rooster. Maddox woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was. The familiar ceiling above him brought reality rushing back. He was home. He'd buried his past. Now came the harder part, reclaiming his future. He found Penny in the barn, milking the cow. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced and sure. Morning, he said, leaning against the stall door. She glanced up, a strand of hair falling across her face. You're up early. Hard to break the habit. He stepped forward. Let me help. Penny hesitated, then slid the milk bucket toward him. I've got chickens to feed. As she stood to leave, Maddox caught her hand. She froze, looking down at where his calloused fingers wrapped around hers. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said quietly, or your trust. But I'm back for good this time, Penny. Her eyes met his, searching. You said that before? The night before you left. The memory hit him hard, their last night together, tangled in sheets, making promises he hadn't been sure he could keep. He'd held her close, whispering of a future together once he'd settled his past. This time is different, he insisted. What I had to do, it's finished. Penny gently extracted her hand from his. Time will tell, Maddox. Words are just words until they're proven true. She walked away, her back straight, her stride purposeful. Maddox watched her go, admiring her strength and cursing the distance between them. He finished milking the cow, then moved on to the other morning chores he remembered so well. By mid-morning, they worked in silent tandem, falling into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Maddox mended a section of fence while Penny tended to the vegetable garden nearby. The familiar work felt good, honest labor under an honest sky. Town's changed some, Penny commented, breaking the silence. Sheriff Miller retired last year. New man's named Holloway. Tough but fair. Maddox nodded. Any trouble while I was gone? Nothing I couldn't handle. Had a group of cattle rustlers try their luck last winter. They weren't expecting a woman with a shotgun. A small smile played at her lips. They won't make that mistake again. Pride swelled in Maddox's chest. You always were a good shot. Got better. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Had to. Maddox drove a nail into the fence post with more force than necessary. I shouldn't have left you alone. Penny straightened, fixing him with a steady gaze. No, you shouldn't have. But you did what you thought you had to do. She brushed dirt from her hands. Question is, was it worth it? The weight of the secret he'd buried pressed down on him. It had to be done. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. Penny studied him for a long moment before returning to her gardening. The silence stretched between them once more, filled with unspoken questions. As the day wore on, clouds gathered on the horizon, promising an evening thunderstorm. They finished their work and headed back to the house just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. On the porch, Penny paused, watching the rain cascade from the eaves. "I used to stand here every evening," she said softly, "watching the road, hoping I'd see you coming home." Maddox's throat tightened. "And now?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Now you're here, but I'm still not sure what that means." Before he could respond, a flash of lightning illuminated her face, the doubt in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lips. Thunder rumbled overhead as the rain intensified. "We should get inside," she said, turning away. Dinner was a quiet affair, interrupted only by the occasional crash of thunder. Afterward, as Penny washed the dishes, Maddox built up the fire in the hearth. The familiar domesticity of it all made his chest ache with longing for what they'd once had. "Why did you stay?" he asked suddenly. "You could have left, found someone else. Started over." Penny's hands stilled in the dishwater. For a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the rain. "I made a promise." "So did I," he countered. "But I left you alone for 3 years. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him. "You left to confront something that haunted you. I stayed to fight my own battles." "We both kept our promises in our own way." Maddox crossed the room to stand before her. "What battles, Penny? What happened while I was gone?" Her green eyes met his, unflinching. "Life happened, Maddox. Drought. Sickness. Loneliness." She took a deep breath. "Your child." The world seemed to stop spinning. "My. What?" "I was with child when you left. I tried to tell you, but you were so determined to go." Penny's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "She lived for 2 days. I named her Margaret, after your mother." Maddox felt as if he'd been struck. He stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the table for support. "Why didn't you write to me? I left you the address in Denver." "I did write. 3 letters. They came back unopened." Tears shimmered in her eyes now. By then, it was too late anyway. She was already gone. The weight of what he'd missed, what he'd lost, crashed down on him. A daughter he'd never know. Penny facing childbirth and loss alone, while he'd been chasing ghosts. "Where is she buried?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking. "Under the old oak, next to your parents." Penny wiped at a stray tear. "I carved the headstone myself." Maddox moved without thinking, pulling Penny into his arms. She stiffened at first, then slowly melted against him, her tears soaking into his shirt. He held her tightly, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "God, Penny, I'm so sorry." They stood like that for a long while, the storm raging outside while they weathered their own within the cabin's walls. When they finally broke apart, something had shifted between them, the first crack in the wall that had separated them since his return. "Tomorrow," Maddox said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'll visit her grave. And then I'll tell you everything, why I left, what I was running from, what I buried up in those hills." Penny nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but dry now. "It's time." That night, they slept in separate rooms, but the distance between them had begun to close. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed everything clean. Maddox rose early and walked to the old oak tree where generations of Quinns had been laid to rest. There, beside the weathered stones of his parents, was a small marker. Crudely carved but made with obvious care, it read simply, "Margaret Quinn, beloved daughter, 1877. Maddox fell to his knees before the tiny grave, overcome by grief for the child he'd never known. He stayed there until the sun was high in the sky, making silent promises to a daughter he would never hold. When he finally returned to the house, Penny was waiting on the porch, her face solemn. "I'm ready to listen," she said simply. They sat side by side on the porch steps, the morning sun warming their faces. Maddox took a deep breath and began the story he'd carried alone for too long. It started in '74, after the bank robbery in Sweetwater. I wasn't part of it, you know. I'd never do something like that, but my friend Patrick was. We grew up together, rode together in the war. He asked me to hide him at the ranch for a few days. I agreed, not knowing what he'd done. Penny listened silently, her hands folded in her lap. When I found out, I told him to leave, to turn himself in. He refused. We argued and… Maddox's voice faltered. He drew on me, Penny. I had no choice. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You killed him! Maddox nodded, the memory still fresh despite the years. I buried him up in the hills where no one would find him. But there was a witness, a man named Samuel Blackburn. He threatened to expose me unless I helped him with his business. What kind of business? Penny asked quietly. The worst kind. Smuggling guns to renegade bands, stirring up trouble with the tribes to justify seizing more land. For years I tried to find a way out. Then I learned he was planning something big, an attack on a peaceful settlement that would trigger a war. I couldn't have that blood on my hands. Maddox stared out at the distant hills. So I gathered evidence against him, tracked down witnesses. 3 years of hunting, building a case solid enough that even his connections couldn't save him. Did it work? Penny asked. Yes. 6 months ago, Blackburn was arrested in Denver. Last month, he was hanged. Maddox turned to face her. What I'd buried up there yesterday were the last pieces of evidence, things that could have implicated others who've already paid for their crimes. It's truly over now. Penny was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he told her. Why didn't you tell me before you left? To protect you. If Blackburn had suspected I was working against him, he would have used you to get to me. Maddox reached tentatively for her hand. I couldn't risk losing you. But you did lose me, Maddox. For 3 years. Her fingers tightened around his. And we lost so much more. The pain in her voice cut deep, but there was something else there too, understanding. Perhaps even forgiveness. I know, he said softly. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, if you'll let me. Penny looked out toward the mountains where Maddox had buried the final remnants of his past. No more secrets? No more secrets, he promised. Everything I am, the good and the bad, is yours to know. She turned to him, tears glistening in her eyes. I never stopped loving you, Maddox. Even when I hated you for leaving, I loved you. The words broke something open inside him, a dam he'd built around his heart the day he'd ridden away from her. He pulled her to him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of loss and hope, regret and promise. When they broke apart, Penny pressed her forehead against his. We can't get back what we lost. No, he agreed. But we can build something new. Over the following weeks, they began the slow process of rebuilding their life together. They worked side by side during the day, tending to the ranch that had somehow become Penny's as much as Maddox's. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, sharing stories of the years they'd spent apart. Maddox learned how Penny had faced the birth of their daughter alone, how she'd held the tiny girl for 2 precious days before pneumonia took her. How the local doctor had been too drunk to help, and the midwife too inexperienced to save the struggling infant. Penny learned of Maddox's lonely years tracking Blackburn across 5 territories, gathering evidence and allies. How he'd been shot twice and left for dead in a Colorado mining town. How he'd kept her photograph with him always, a reminder of what he was fighting to return to. Each story shared was another stitch in the fabric that had been torn between them. Some days were easier than others. There were arguments, heated words exchanged about trust and abandonment, about choices made and consequences suffered. But there was healing, too, in the honest confrontation of their pain. A month after Maddox's return, they rode together to the hills where he'd buried his past. The summer wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the slopes in vibrant colors. At the spot where he dug his final hole, Maddox dismounted and helped Penny down from her horse. "This is where it ends," he said, gesturing to the now undisturbed earth. "Everything that kept me from you is buried here." Penny knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the ground. "Not just an ending," she said softly. "A beginning, too." They stood together on the hillside, looking down at the valley that had been their home. The ranch looked small from this height, but it was theirs, a place to build the future they'd once only dreamed of. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maddox knelt before Penny on their porch. In his hand was a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs. "I've been working on this since I came back," he explained, opening it to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect pearl. "I know we have a lot to rebuild, but I want to do it right this time. As husband and wife." Tears spilled down Penny's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The following spring, they were married under the old oak tree, with Margaret's grave adorned with fresh flowers nearby. The entire valley turned out for the occasion, ranchers and townspeople who had watched Penny wait faithfully for the man who had finally returned to her. As they exchanged vows, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, as if the spirits of those they'd lost were offering their blessing. "I, Maddox Quinn, take you, Penny Donovan, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To cherish and protect, to honor and respect, for all the days of my life. I, Penny Donovan, take you, Maddox Quinn, to be my husband," she replied, her green eyes shining with tears and joy. "To support and challenge, to comfort and inspire, for all the days of my life." The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing in the barn that Maddox had repaired and expanded over the winter months. As the evening wore on, they slipped away from the festivities, walking hand in hand to the small hill that overlooked their property. Under the vast canopy of stars, Maddox pulled Penny close, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair. "I once thought my past would always haunt me," he said softly. "That I'd never be free of it." Penny rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And now? Now I know that burying the past isn't about forgetting it. It's about not letting it control your future." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Our future." In the years that followed, the Quinn ranch flourished under their joint care. The cattle herd grew, and they added horses, fine stock that became sought after throughout the territory. The small house expanded to accommodate their growing family. 2 years after their wedding, Penny gave birth to twin boys Michael and Patrick. A daughter followed 3 years later, a green-eyed, spirited girl they named Eleanor, after Penny's mother. Each spring, they took the children to visit Margaret's grave, ensuring that their firstborn was never forgotten. Maddox never returned to the spot where he'd buried the evidence of his darkest days. There was no need. The man who had hidden secrets in the hills had been transformed by love, by loss, by the passage of time. The ghosts that had once haunted him found no purchase in a life filled with purpose and joy. Sometimes, Penny would find him standing on the porch at dusk, staring up at the distant slopes. On those occasions, she would slip her hand into his, a silent reminder that he had found his way home. "Do you ever regret waiting for me?" he asked her once, on the 10th anniversary of his return. Penny, her beauty matured by motherhood and hard work, considered the question carefully. "I waited because I believed in what we could be together. Not what we had been, but what we might become." She squeezed his hand. "How could I regret something that gave me this life?" In 1892, a railway line came through Pine Creek Valley, bringing change and opportunity. The Quinn Ranch, now one of the most prosperous in the territory, adapted and thrived in the changing times. Maddox and Penny, their hair beginning to silver, welcomed the future with the same determination with which they had overcome their past. They never spoke of those 3 years apart as wasted time. Instead, they recognized them as the forge in which their love had been tested, tempered, and made stronger. The cowboy who had buried his past in the hills and the woman who had waited at the bottom had built something enduring together, a legacy of love that would outlast them both. And on quiet evenings, When the children were asleep and the work was done, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills that had once separated them. In those peaceful moments, with Penny's head resting on Maddox's shoulder, they knew that some journeys, no matter how difficult, lead exactly where they're meant to.